Hey guys, welcome back to CCL Biology, the channel for easy to understand biology lessons. If you're looking for help with general, AP, or college intro biology, you are in the right place. I am your friendly bio nerd. Thank you so much for tuning into my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about organic compounds. So if you want a better understanding of organic compounds, then stay tuned. While you're here, don't forget to hit the like button and comment below if you find this video to be helpful. And if you want more easy to understand biology lessons, then be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell to get updates about new videos that go up every week. Okay, as I said, this video is about organic compounds. We're just going to take a look at some basic components of organic compounds. An organic compound is a compound that contains carbon. Now, I talk more about this in my carbon video, so be sure to check that out. I'll have the link to that video in the description box below. So here are some examples here, some illustrations of organic compounds. Now, I do want to talk about one small exception to this rule. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is sometimes considered inorganic, even though it does contain carbon. Now, that's because carbon dioxide doesn't have any hydrogens, and typically organic compounds have at least one hydrogen. Carbon dioxide is also a really simple molecule. But other than that, if a compound has carbon in it, it's going to be considered organic. Now, because organic compounds all have carbon and usually also have hydrogen as their base components, we call that carbon-hydrogen base the carbon skeleton. Now, organic compounds can be built with all sorts of elements, and they can range from simple to very complex. But when you strip away all that other fluff and get down to just the carbon and hydrogen atoms, then you're looking at the carbon skeleton. So if we look at this compound here with this fun-sounding name, 1-bromo-3-chlorobutane, and you don't have to worry about naming unless you're in organic chemistry. So we see some carbons represented by the C's. The H's are for hydrogens, and then we have the bromine and a chlorine. So if I were to take away this chlorine and the bromine, then we would just be looking at the carbon skeleton with the carbons and the hydrogens. Now, some organic compounds contain only carbon and hydrogen atoms. Those compounds are called hydrocarbons. Now, I go through some examples of hydrocarbons also in that carbon video. Now, organic compounds can differ in their structure from one compound to the next in 4 key ways that we're going to look at now. So one way that compounds can differ in structure is in the length. They can have either long carbon chains or short carbon chains. Now, this is mostly determined by the number of carbons there are in the compound. So I have some illustrations here. Let's take a look. So here we see a carbon chain with a number of carbons. I'm not going to count them, but this would probably be considered a longer carbon chain, okay, versus this organic compound that has only 2 carbons. All right, so much shorter. All right, here also we see 4 compounds that all end with ane: methane, ethane, propane, and butane. As you can see, the methane has 1 carbon, ethane has 2, propane has 3, and butane has 4. So notice the chain is getting longer and longer as we're adding carbons to it. Another way that the structure can differ from one compound to another is in branching. Organic compound structures can be unbranched, and that means that all of the carbons exist in space in a single line, or they can be branched, meaning that at least one of the carbons within that compound branches out from the main line, for lack of a better term, to create its own separate line, kind of like a branch on a tree. So let's look at some examples here. All right, so here I've got what's called an unbranched chain, and this is decane, by the way. It has 10 carbons, and all of the carbons are in a single line. So this would be an unbranched chain. All right, same here with this butane, unbranched. Now, don't let the hydrogens throw you off. I know the hydrogens aren't in line with the carbons, but when we're talking about branching, we're looking only at the carbons. If all of the carbons are in a single line, then that's called unbranched. Now, if we go here, we see that this compound has 4 carbons, just like this one does, but one of the carbons is out forming its own line or its own branch. So this would be a branched compound here. This is isobutane. All right, and then here we have another branched compound. Now, one thing that I do want to point out, because it can be tricky, in order for a compound to be considered branched, at least one carbon, like I said, has to be, separate from the main line, but it has to be an internal carbon, meaning not one of the carbons at the end. So this compound is branched because we have this carbon here that's branching out, this carbon here that's branching out, and then these three. Now we do see this carbon here that looks like it's not a part of the main line, but it actually is. So this is not an internal carbon, it's an end carbon. All right, so if an end carbon can't be considered branched. So sometimes it's written like this just to save space, but sometimes your teachers will also do it like that to kind of trick you and make you think that it is branched. So make sure that you pay attention to that. Only internal carbons, meaning carbons that aren't at the end of the line, can be considered branched. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons are the branched ones. But this is still overall a branched compound because it does have at least one branched carbon. Another way that organic compounds can differ in their structure is with bonds. Now there can be single, double, or triple bonds between the atoms. And if there's a double bond, sometimes a double bond can be in a different position between two organic compounds that are almost exactly the same except for the position of that bond. So let's look at these illustrations to see what I'm talking about. So here we have 3 different structures that all have the same beginning, that prop, P-R-O-P, which is because they all have 3 carbons. Again, learning the names of these structures is something that you typically do if you're going to take organic chemistry, so don't worry so much about that. But the reason that they're different, we see propane, propene, and propyne, is because of the bond that is between the carbon atoms. So here we can see this carbon is bonded to another carbon with a single bond, okay? Whereas these 2 carbons here in propene have 2 bonds in between them. That's a double bond, all right? And then here in propyne, we see a triple bond. Okay, so because the bonds are different, single, double, and triple, that essentially changes the compound. These are not the same compounds. They're related, but they're not the same compound. Now let's go back to what I was saying before about the double bonds that can kind of change positions. So here again, we see 2 compounds that look really similar, and their names are similar, 1 pentene and 2 pentene. Each of them has 5 carbons, which is why they're called, which is where the pent comes from. But the double bond is in 2 different places. So here we see the double bond in between the first and second carbons going from left to right. And here we see the double bond going between the second and third carbons going from left to right. So it shifted places. And because that double bond is in 2 different places, these are not going to be the same compound. This is 1 pentene because the bond starts after the first carbon. So that's where the 1 comes from. And here the 2 is because the bond starts after the second carbons. And the last way that organic compounds can differ from each other in their structure is with the presence of rings. Now, some compounds exist in space as a ring rather than as a straight line or as a branched chain. So that's what we see here. So here we have 1 hexene, and this says C1. I don't want you to think it says Cl, but it says C1, basically just saying that's the first carbon. So the black circles represent the carbon. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. The whitish gray balls, of course, are the hydrogens. So this is 1 hexene with 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens. Here we have another structure. Let's count the carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons as well. And if we go through and count the hydrogens, we'll see that there are 12 hydrogens, just like there are here. So why are these 2 different compounds? Because their structure is different. Whereas this is an unbranched compound, this is a ring compound. So this is called cyclohexane. Of course, the cyclo indicates that ring structure. Not every ringed organic compound is going to have the word cyclo in it. But if you do see a compound that has the word cyclo in it, then you know that it's going to have a ring somewhere in its structure. All right, so again, even though they have the same number of carbons and hydrogens, they're 2 different compounds because one has a ring structure and the other doesn't. Now, typically with ring structures, a lot of times you'll see the ring without any letters on it, or at least without C's and H's. There may be other letters, but a lot of times the C's and the H's are left out just for the sake of simplicity, just to make the drawing not, I guess, be so crowded or confusing. But the carbons and hydrogens are still there. So when you're looking at a ring structure, the corners of the ring, or the angles, each represent a carbon, okay? So here we're looking at a structure that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those are 6 carbons, and the hydrogens that are bonded to them are there as well. Okay, and then you may see some of these lines within the structure here. So this is representing a double bond. So this is a double bond here, because each of the lines of the ring, I should go back and say, represent a bond. So let me back up a little bit. So this is a carbon at this point, and this is a carbon at this point, and they're bonded. This line is representing a bond. Same down here, and so on and so forth. But here between these 2 carbons, there's a double bond. That's what this means. Okay? Between these 2 carbons is a single bond. Then we've got another double, single, double. Okay? So what this structure really looks like if we were to add those carbons and hydrogens back to the illustration would be like this. All right, and this is benzene. Okay, so we see our 6 carbons and our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hydrogens. Benzene is C6H6. All right, now let's jump back to those hydrocarbons for a quick second. Remember, hydrocarbons are the compounds that are going to have just hydrogen and carbon. Now, all hydrocarbons are going to have 2 characteristics in common. One is that they're all nonpolar. So what does that mean? What is polarity? Polarity is created by the difference in electronegativity between atoms in a molecule or a compound. Okay, so let me break that down a little bit. A molecule or a compound is going to have more than one atom in it. So each atom has a certain degree of electronegativity. The difference between those degrees of electronegativity is what determines polarity. Now, I do have another video, I think it's called Molecular Compounds, where I talk about polarity. So definitely check that out if you want to learn more about that, and I'll link that below. But polar compounds have a significant difference or a large difference in that electronegativity, whereas nonpolar compounds have little or no difference in electronegativity. So hydrocarbons fall in the nonpolar category. The carbon and the hydrogens that are involved in the bond have very little difference in their electronegativity. So essentially, they are pulling with almost equal force on the electrons that are being shared. All right, so in this case, these 2 electrons here, the hydrogen is pulling just about as hard as the carbon is. So it's a similar electronegativity, so that makes this bond always nonpolar. And a nonpolar compound is also going to be hydrophobic, which means it's not attracted to water. Of course, if you break that word down, hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fear, so it's almost like it has a fear of water. So that's a key word in biology, so make sure you know what it means. Hydrophobic means not attracted to water. Just to note, the opposite is hydrophilic, which means it is attracted to water. All right, so here are just some other examples, not with hydrocarbons, but just some other examples of some polar molecules versus some nonpolar ones. Okay, and then here's an illustration here of an oil spill. So oil is a hydrocarbon, so it's nonpolar. And a lot of times when you have an oil spill, you can see, if the picture takes it right, you can see the oil sitting on top of the water. So that's where that hydrophobicity comes in. Basically, it's not attracted to the water, so it's not going to mix or dissolve or anything like that or blend with the water. It's going to try to stay separate from it. Of course, it can't fly away or jump away from the water, but it can kind of create a separate layer. And that's usually what you see happen when you're looking at oil spills. The second common characteristic among all hydrocarbons is that they store a lot of energy, and that energy is released when the bonds in between them are broken, aka when they participate in chemical reactions. So if the bond between the carbon and the hydrogen is broken, there's a large release of energy. So this is what makes hydrocarbons great for things like fuel. So the gasoline that goes in vehicles is made of hydrocarbons. So here's just an example here. So we see octane, of course it has 8 carbons, and heptane, and then just another little snippet of a hydrocarbon that makes gasoline. So you put the gas in the car and you crank it, and then you get a number of chemical reactions, but essentially what's happening is the bonds within those hydrocarbons are being broken, energy is being released, and that energy is what's actually fueling the car to move. Now, it's not the only place that hydrocarbons are found as an energy source. Hydrocarbons are also a major component of fats, which is really just stored energy for plants and animals. So here we see what's called adipose tissue, that's just fatty tissue. So they're stored there. If those bonds are broken through some type of chemical reaction, then it's going to release energy. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope it was helpful for you. If so, please let me know by leaving a thumbs up in the comments section below. And if you have any remaining questions, then please type those in the comments, and I'll do my best to provide you with an answer. Thanks again so much for watching CCL Biology, that is Christ-Centered Life. God bless and bye-bye.